Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this Illinois Youth Career Pathway Grant Opportunity TA session. My name is Kirsten Bayer with the Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support at Illinois State University, and I will be the moderator and technical support for today's webinar. Today's topic is performance measures with our speaker, Paula Berry. And before we get started with Paula, we are going to just do a couple housekeeping things. As a reminder, all participants on this call are in listen-only mode and they cannot unmute themselves. If you have questions as the webinar proceeds, please post those in the chat or the Q&A and we will address them at the end of the webinar. This webinar is being recorded and the materials and recording from today will be up on Illinois WorkNet within 48 hours. I will put the direct link for where you can access the recording and the PowerPoint slides from today. If you would like to follow along or download the PowerPoint slides right now, you can do so. I'll put that link in the chat momentarily here. And then in an effort to be as accessible as possible, this webinar will be offering closed captioning on the recorded version. If you need those capabilities, please feel free to access the recorded version on our YouTube, and those closed captionings will be on there and accurate. And then a reminder, if you have faulty internet connection or audio connection this morning, please feel free to call in using your cell phone, and you can do so using the phone number and the original registration email that was sent to you. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to our presenter for today, Paula Berry.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Paula Berry, and I work in Office of Employment and Training in the Performance and Reporting Unit. So with that being said, I will be the one to give you a high-level overview of our WIOA, Workforce Investment and Opportunity Act, youth performance measures. So you have an understanding of being a youth grantee, the type of performance that would be expected from your participants. So what are the WIOA Youth Performance Indicators? There are 5. There are 3 that are related to employment and 2 that are related directly to training. I'm going to explain a little bit of WIOA participation activities versus exit and those concepts and how they affect performance, what they have to do with your performance, your participants' performance, the expectations of your participants' performance. There are goals for each different performance measure for youth. And then there are levels that you can meet, exceed, or fail the negotiated levels or goals of performance. And then one more point I'll touch on is a requirement to follow up with the youth after you exit them, or in other words, when they are done being served in your program, and the performance impacts that your good follow-up will provide to your program. So next slide, please, Kirsten. So youth grantees will work with and provide WIOA services for participants, and then once they leave the program, they become exiters. So a participant are your reportable individuals who you'll be serving. They're going to be receiving services once you enroll them, when they become eligible for your program. And then a program exit is when your participants are actually exited from your program. You're not serving them anymore. There's a specific exit date related to when you last provided them a service, which are tracked and reported consistently through your entire program. And then the important part, as far as it goes with performance measures, once a youth is exited from the program, they're considered an exiter. That starts the clock on all of these performance measures, except for one. Performance can be a little bit confusing. So at the end, you can stop and ask me any questions you want, and you'll have my contact information. So this is very high level because I know that this is just for potential grantees. So next slide, please, Kirsten. Okay, the 5 WIOA Title I youth performance measures are employment or education the 2nd quarter after exit, employment or education in the 4th quarter after they exit, their median earnings in the second quarter after they exit your program, a credential attainment rate, and a measurable skills gain. So some of those measures speak for themselves, but I'll go over them briefly. On the next slide, please. Okay, so the measures I mentioned that are related to employment or education are these three. So next slide, please. We'll start with so youth employment or education in their second quarter after they exit. So what this means is once you're done, you've served a youth, they've progressed through your program, it's time to leave their WIOA participation. They're no longer receiving service. So you literally exit them in our reporting system and the clock starts. So 2 full quarters after they exit your program, we need to find them in either employment with wages or supplemental or some type of post-secondary education program. And when we find them in one of those 2 outcomes, a youth, that will be your performance outcome. They'll be in the numerator. So who's in the measure? All of your youth will be in this employment measure. And it's the outcomes are percentages, and they're calculated. They're the percentage of participants who are employment or education training in the second quarter after they exit. Supplemental wages count. And the calculation is the number of participants who exited during the reporting period who are found to be employed in the second quarter after exit divided by the number of participants who exited during the quarter. So I won't give an example like this to bore you for every single measure, but if you have 20 program participants and you exit them all in 1 quarter, and that's the denominator, it's 20 exiters, but you found out in the second quarter that 10 of them are in employment, we got wages for them. So it's 10 in the numerator divided by 20, the denominator, that yields a rate of 50% for your youth employment or education. Same thing, if 5 were in employment, you documented another 5 being in education, it would be 10 divided by 20, that is your rate. The rate increases the more you find in employment, obviously. So for the next slide, please. This one's easy. It's the exact same measure, but it's 4 quarters out after exit. So it's the youth to be found in employment or education, an entire 4 quarters post exit. And then I can explain that a tiny bit. So if you exit today in February 25th, that is their exit quarter. Their first quarter post-exit starts April, May, June. Their second quarter after exit starts 7/1 and goes through the end of September. So it's the first quarter after they exit. So that's how far we're going out to track these youth for their positive performance outcomes. Next slide, please. So the third measure that's related to youth employment, so this is just a note about the employment or education second and fourth quarters after exit. I included this slide because if you become a grantee, you'll realize that, when we upload their wages, so we will know if your youth are in employment in their second or fourth quarters after exit, regardless of the type of data you enter. However, this is like an extra condition for youth. The other programs that we work with for adults, for example, they just get employment to count. But for youth, we get to count a positive performance outcome if we can document that they've entered a post-secondary education. So that's why when I move on to follow up as part of your program, it's really important for you to achieve your positive performance outcomes and higher rates of performance. Post-secondary, advanced academic, occupational skills training recorded are going to help you get these outcomes. So next slide, please. Then the third measure related to employment is youth median earnings. And they're the median earnings of participants who are in employment second quarter after exit. And next slide, please. I'll give an example of this. So in this example, there are 9 youth, say for example, in your program who exited the program, and you had 9 in employment second quarter after exit. For the median, this is exactly how it's calculated. They're listed, and the median wage out of that list is extracted, and that is your median earnings calculation for youth. Next slide, please. This is just demonstrating for median, when your list is actually an even number, you just average the 2 middle outcomes, and that yields your median wage that's calculated for your youth. Next slide, please. Okay, and as I said, there were 5 youth measures, 3 related to employment, 2 are directly related to if your youth have received a training service as part of their WIOA participation. These are a credential attainment rate. The credentials just need to be earned anytime during participation to the date that they're enrolled, and they have up to a year, a full 365 days after they exit the program, and then a measurable skills gain. And these are gains that are documented throughout the program and in every single year that the youth participates in your WIOA program. Training program, I should say. Next slide, please. So for the credential attainment rate, these are all calculated the same. When the number of exiters in 1 quarter, and then youth who attain a credential. So if you exit 18, I should give myself an easier number, 10 youth and 7 earn a credential either during the program or a whole year after they exit, then your rate is 7 divided by 10. So you would have a credential attainment rate of 70%. Who is in the measure? It's important because this is different from your employment measures. Everyone's going to be in your employment or education second and fourth quarter after exit, but not all your youth will be in this measure, only those who receive training. On-the-job training programs will not count your youth in this measure. And again, you have an entire year for them to attain a credential. Next slide, please. Some of these slides are long, but they're more informational purposes in case you ever need to go back and look at this performance information. But it's important to know if you
I'm sorry, Paula, to interrupt you. I'm sorry, Paula, to interrupt you, but your audio seems a little fuzzy. I'm not sure, Tara, if you're hearing the same thing.
I am.
But it was just working perfectly fine, the last slide, Paula. Yeah, it's still a little fuzzy. I'm not sure if it's your connection or...
Oh, I'm fuzzy?
Oh, there you go.
Oh, you're back. You're back.
Okay, because you were just very fuzzy too. So is it me? Is it my connection?
I'm not sure, but you sound clear now, so we'll keep going.
Could you hear anything about the credential?
No. I don't believe everything on this slide was fuzzy on my audio.
Yeah, I would just start from the beginning of this slide.
Just this slide?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, I hadn't really said anything when you cut in. So this slide is just reiterating, some of them are longer, but they're for more informational purposes for you to go back and review these measures. But for the credential attainment rate, what is really important for grantees to realize is that when a youth is exited and they only have a high school diploma or an equivalent, that is not enough to count as a credential. The youth needs to either go on to employment or earn another post-secondary credential, and they have a year after they exit to do that. But just as a part of your program, just know that high school diplomas aren't going to count as the credential. Okay, so next slide, please. This is a list of industry recognized credentials that will count when they are recorded towards your credential attainment rate. There is, a list provided. This is provided by United States Department of Labor of what these credentials should entail. So next slide, please. This just further defines and clarifies what a recognized post-secondary credential is and what you will need to have for your youth to count as their credential. It's a credential consisting of an industry recognized certificate or certification, and these are just examples that can be used. And then it goes on to say they must be recognized technology, industry, occupational skills for the specific industry or occupation, rather than just general safety skills, hygiene skills. They should actually lead to an occupation, not just an extra skill. So next slide, please. The next slide will be a list. So certificates that do not count. These are examples like your OSHA or safety courses. Work readiness certificates are not enough. CPR, while those could be very beneficial or help someone in their career or occupation, they're not standalone credentials. Next slide, please. Okay, so moving on to the 5th youth performance measure called measurable skill gains. So this is one performance measure, but there are many different ways that your youth participating in training in your program can get these MSGs. So the whole purpose is just to track and measure important progressions and achievements made by these training participants through pathways in their training and even in employment. And it's intended to capture, again, this is just redundant a little bit, but this is a lot of gray area. It's a new WIOA measure. And so there's a lot of different ways these can be calculated. Okay, next slide, please, for MSG. These are the 5 types of measurable skills gain. Every year you are serving a WIOA youth participant and they're in a training in your program. One of these measurable skills gains needs to be recorded in the system. It can either be a post-secondary transcript or report card example. That would be someone in high school or GED. That's post-secondary, I'm sorry. So advanced training, occupational skills training. Your secondary transcript report card is secondary school. Training milestones. A good example of this is achievements that they make in like JT or a registered apprenticeship. While they may not be the end industry recognized credential, they're milestones, skills progression diploma certificate, and educational functioning level. And there's 2 ways to record that. So I'll go on and quickly describe what's needed for each of these on the next slide, please. So who is in the measurable skills gain measure? All in-school youth. Since they're in school, they're in the measure no matter what. Out-of-school youth who during each program year enroll in a training or secondary education program, they're going to be in this measure. So you need a skill for them. Next slide, please. Okay, post-secondary transcript report card. This kind of speaks for itself. It's full-time. Students need 12 credits in a semester to count for this. Part-time students need a minimum of 12 credits completed in 2 back-to-back quarters. So they're calculated differently, and the documentation is just a transcript or report card that shows its successful grades or completion in a post-secondary school or training. Next slide, please. Secondary transcript is the same, and it applies to participants in a high school or GED type program, adult secondary, and it's their transcript or report card that is used to document successful passage or completion in secondary school. And I should point out that modules or tests that are being passed as part of a equivalency program, you actually need the diploma at the end. When they're in a secondary school, transcripts count, but not for an equivalency type program along the way. Okay, next slide, please. And this is just 2 rules, and they have to be successful, transcript showing successful completion. They can't be failing or have negative type progress reports. Next slide, please. The third type of measurable skills gain is a training milestone, and I mentioned a little bit. So it can be a satisfactory or better progress report towards established milestones of their training programs, and they could just be reflecting upon an individual's individual employment plan, or for youth, the ISS, individual service strategy for a youth, that just is showing that they're progressing along. And this is not necessarily calculable information, like we have the list of credentials that apply. This just has to make sense with the training that they're in and be case noted. And they're not, these training milestones, what we're talking about here, are not necessarily based on a written exam or a test. Next slide, please. A training milestone could just be a note from an employer, even a wage increase in their work, in their, like an OJT, for example, something like that could be documented as a type of MSG, which is a training milestone. One example is the second bullet point. It's training reports on milestones that are completed as the job skills are mastered, or smaller steps to complete the overall program for the credential. That's what we're looking here for the training milestone MSG. Next slide, please. And then we have the skills progression or diploma or certificate, and these are more what can be measured by a successful passage of an exam that's required for the end occupation or for the end credential. Skills progressions are documented by written assessments or exams that lead to the credential or certificate. So again, it could just be the high school diploma itself or the industry recognized credential. You would definitely count that for both the MSG and the credential, or any other type of advanced degree. Next slide, please. These are examples of this type of MSG, like I just named some of them. So steps along the way to their credential. So next slide, please. Okay, so this is for the measurable skills gain, the fifth kind that is for a gain in someone's educational functioning level for MSG. So assessment scores that are documented in this system will be calculated for this type of measurable skills gain. You need one full EFL that will be measured and compared by a participant's pre and post test scores. So that is how this type of MSG for EFL is calculated. Next slide, please. Okay, and this type of measurable skills gain is for when someone leaves your program who is not in post-secondary, say they just had a high school diploma, and during follow-up, it's recognized that within the program year, they have gone into a type of post-secondary education or training on their own, independent of WIOA. That in itself can be documented as a type of measurable skills gain. Next slide, please. Here I have listed DOL guidance, if you ever need it in the future, to go back, and these are this explicit rules regarding youth performance and services, specifically in TEAL 2116, and all the performance measures are outlined in the TEAL 1016 and 1418. I just always include that because performance is a lot, and not that you need to know it. I understand that, but it can't hurt to have the written guidance. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is an overview, and I'm pretty sure that since you've had maybe participated in some of these other webinars, you probably have been introduced. But I just want to make you aware of how these tie into performance that will be looked at. So when a person is just receiving basic type services, you're not enrolling them into WIOA. But at the point when you enroll them, say you become a grantee and you have these participants, they're being enrolled and you're providing real services. Maybe it's just career services or workforce prep, but we're reporting them and they're being counted and looked at by United States Department of Labor and the state. Then the next level, perhaps, is when you're enrolling them in some type of training. And this is occupational skills training, college, and OJT is one type of training. And this is all what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the Credential and MSG. Once you get a participant to this training level of WIOA participation and funding, that's when they're going to be included in the additional 2 Credential and MSG measures. When you're just serving them at an individualized career service level, they're all going to be in your employment and education rate second and fourth quarter after exit. At some point when they're no longer in need of either individualized career or training service, you exit them. And for youth, there are a variety of supportive services that can be provided during participation and after you exit them. I mentioned that exit when they leave the program. And for youth, this gray arrow is follow-up services. And for youth, the United States Department of Labor requires 100% that follow-up services are provided for all youth exiters. So next slide, please. So when we talk about performance, we have all of these measures, but how do we know how well anyone's doing in them? And this is because there are WIOA performance goals, and they're negotiated. They are not just set. So at the state level, we negotiate our goals for each of these measures with the United States Department of Labor. And we negotiate based upon all this data and how our state's exiters and WIOA participants have been doing. And the goal is that obviously the performance targets are increased, so we keep serving participants and doing better and better each year. So then after the state negotiates, we negotiate with all of these local workforce innovation boards to determine different performance goals for different LWIAs. They all have different demographics, so that just makes sense. So that's where these goals are coming from that I believe you probably saw in the NOFO that Tara included those in there. So next slide, please. So this was included in Tara's information. And so you see youth performance measures, and it's entity by organization. So DCEO is the state, and then each LWIA and the goals are listed for each of the measures I just described. So you can see how much they vary depending on the area, and what individual provider grantees will be accountable for is probably related to the local workforce innovation area. I'll let Tara speak to that. Next slide, please. So basically, what good is having a goal if we're not going to determine how you meet it? So meeting a goal is when you meet, like you saw that screen. So say it was 70% for youth employment or education. You need to be right at 70% or 90% of the threshold. So if you don't meet 90% of a goal, that's not your fail. It's 90% of the goal. The Department of Labor set a threshold for us. To exceed it, you have to exceed the goal itself. There's no threshold to exceed. And then if you fail it, it's because your outcome is below the 90% threshold. So like when I was talking about you exiting 10 youth, and then say you only found 5 to be employed in the second quarter after you exit them, that would be a rate of 50% for youth employed or education in the second quarter after exit. If your goal was 80%, you wouldn't even meet the threshold. So that would be technically a failure. So next slide, please. This is just an example. I'll go over it quickly, a brief calculation of how we determine that. So for your outcomes, again, meet, exceed, fail, an example calculation would be DCEO, I have it highlighted in green. Our negotiated rate for a youth employment rate second quarter after exit happened to be 73.5. So to determine the threshold, you just take 73.5 times 90%, which actually equals 66.15. So our outcomes could actually go as low based on the numerator and denominators of 66.5. So to meet this, we have to be in between 66.15, which is the threshold, to the negotiated rate of 73.5. So to exceed it, we have to be above 73.5. So I use 73.6, and then a failure is anything below that 90% threshold. So 66.14 would be calculated, and that would end up being a failure of that rate. And it's the same for all of them. And for the median earnings, the threshold is literally the 3,275 times 90%. Next slide, please. This is an example of our system and last year's final outcomes, which were for PY19. And you can see that's our negotiated goal. These are youth measures. It lists the 90% threshold, the actual outcome, and then the percentage of the thresholds. And so for the 3 that we were accountable in 19, we exceeded them. This is not a good example because in 19, a couple of the youth measures were considered baseline. So all that meant is that we didn't have enough data to negotiate a goal, but that's not the case anymore. We're on the hook for all 5 youth measures. So next slide, please. And again, before I lead into this last part about follow-up services, I was just reiterating the path that WIOA takes participants on throughout their service. And then some examples on the other one I meant to mention to you, some examples of the types of service are listed on this slide under the arrows, as well as Mark Burgess did this slide, and it's really nice because it tells you when they are triggered for performance. So like I said, anyone you enroll is going to be in employment, and then the training services, they're going to be in those teachers. Okay, slide, please.
Paula, your audio kind of cut out again. That last little bit that you said right before you said next slide was fuzzy. Yeah, you're still a little.
Something the system because
You're cutting in and
am
out.
I now?
Oh wait,
You're back.
you're back.
Right. Okay, because you were cutting in and out too. So I'm wondering if it has to be my connection for something. So I'm sorry.
No, you're fine.
This slide.
At least it keeps coming back. So.
Right. Okay. Because I haven't moved or done anything. I have no idea. So this slide is a repeat because I just wanted to once again reiterate the path that your grantee or youth participants will take in their WIOA participation, from individualized to potential training, maybe supportive, and then exit leads to follow-up. Okay, so next slide, please. So this is, I just wanted to mention that once you are done serving youth, either with career type services or training, they're exited, and then follow-up is required for up to a year for all youth. And the thing about follow-up, like I mentioned, and it's all kind of tied to performance, is that if you want their positive outcome for your employment or education second quarter after exit measure, and you know they're not working, but they could potentially have put themselves into post-secondary, the only way you'll ever know about some of these outcomes and get your credit for that is to follow up with them. We can upload their wages if they happen to be employment, but if you lose contact with them, you need to try to follow up with them to determine how they're doing even after they exit. Next slide, please. Again, I just want to reiterate, how will follow-up after exit lead to your positive performance outcomes, that you definitely want to take credit for all of your work that you've done with these youth. So credential attainment, most definitely. Like I mentioned, you have a whole year after they exit. If they don't get their credential in the program directly working with you, or they only get their high school diploma working with you, you have a whole year to follow up with them and document and find out if they've gotten their credential, and then you'll get your outcome. And then again, like I said, youth have that other condition to meet for employment, which is their education in the second and fourth quarters that you can document, and you'll get credit for a positive performance outcome there. And sometimes for our provider grantees with these youth projects, if you don't have a huge pool of youth, it's very critical that you maintain or document every single outcome, because just like anything else, it's harder to achieve a high percentage with very few people. I mean, you're talking numerator denominator. 3 out of 5 is barely over 50% employment rate or any other performance measure rate. Next measure, please. Next slide, please. Again, this is very repetitive at this point because I just said it. You have these follow-up circumstances where when you document certain outcomes for these youth, it's going to give you credit for performance. And next slide. I said this earlier without even looking at the slide, that again, with credential attainment rate, you have a year. So follow-up gives you the opportunity to find and document these outcomes. Next slide, please. So that's the end of my presentation. If anyone has any questions for me, I see there's only 3 attendees, so you can either put it in the chat, or if something comes up later, you can email me.
Paula, we did have one question. Kathy would like to know, ACT, Work Keys, National Career Readiness Certificate, or the Work Readiness Credential would not count?
Work readiness, no. Those actually wouldn't count because the certificates themselves aren't earned through WIOA training. I believe that would be job readiness, workforce prep, career type services. So if you're only in a service that is like a career service and is not WIOA training, you wouldn't be in the credential or measurable skills gain anyway. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Kathy says yes, thank you. Okay, well, I don't see any other questions.
And I was just going to say the main point I wanted to drive home with everyone with performance, as Paula said, it is a lot. She comes in multiple times during the grant period to kind of give us refreshers, and she really walks with us through the grant process regarding performance. And we start that very early on, just so you have that support. The main goal is to make sure when you're putting folks in your program, you're using realistic numbers. So that's my biggest thing, and making sure that you're able to hit each of those categories. So I always like to challenge grantees, don't say you're putting 100 people in your program and 100 are going to get credential attainment and 100 are going to, go off to post-secondary or employment. Use realistic numbers. Sorry, that's my coworker. Use realistic numbers, but also make sure that you're able to capture those students. And again, these grants are 1 year on paper, but in essence, you're really working with the youth for 2 years. So I just like to caution everyone with that and really lead with that. This is 2 years that you're working with students. So if you're having trouble tracking them down for basic paperwork, birth certificates, things like that, I would second guess, yourself putting them in a program just because you have to hold on to them for 2 years. So I just wanted to put those quick notes in as well.
Thanks, Tara.
Great, thank you to both of you. I don't see any other questions in the chat. I did want to reiterate that this session is recorded and it will be up on the Illinois WorkNet site within 48 hours. So if you know of someone else who could benefit from this session and maybe they couldn't attend today because the session was rescheduled, please feel free to send out that link that I've already put in the chat. It houses all of the TA session slides and recordings. And that is all I have today. Tara or Paula, do you have anything else?
That's it. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you so much, everyone. We appreciate your time today, and everyone have a great rest of your Thursday.
You too. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.